now. In August of 2003, and I was just thinking that is 11 years ago now, Debbie and I went camping with some friends on a big lake near our home in South Dakota, in the United States, and I'm undressing here. I need to do that. We grilled steaks. We had the marvelous pleasure of sleeping on the ground, not having access to a shower for 3 days, and we had a run-in with a skunk. I think we have a picture of a skunk. I don't know. I don't think there are any skunks in Korea, but they're black and white furry creatures, rodents, and they smell bad. And they have the ability to transfer that scent to you by spraying it on you, and it is horrendous. And we had a run-in with one of those. Fortunately, we didn't get sprayed. If you ever want to hear a really funny story, ask me. It's a great story about that skunk. On one of the couple we were camping with also had a speedboat, and we got to ride on an inner tube across the lake at high speed. Oh boy, that was fun too. On one of the trips of the boat, a thunderstorm came over the horizon to the west. And I'd lived in that area most of my life, and when the storm clouds come over the hill, I knew it was time to get off the lake. But our friend wasn't from the area and didn't realize the danger, and he decided that he would stay on the lake a little while longer. That wasn't a good decision. After about 15 minutes, the sky was dark and it began to rain. And the wind came up, and the wind created these waves on the big lake that were taller, much taller than the boat, and much taller than us. And fortunately, our friend knew how to navigate in dangerous water, but it took us much longer to get back to the shore than it took us to get to where we were on the lake in the first place. All around us, the water was cold, angry. It's this green color, and each time the boat would hit a wave, Debbie and I, who happened to be sitting in the back of the boat, got drenched with this freezing cold water. We made it back to the shore and got the boat on the trailer and to pull it out of the lake. For the life of me, I don't even know how that happened, except that God protected us from our own stupidity. It was an unpleasant, frightening experience, and almost every year on that lake, someone drowns because they don't understand the power of the storms that blow up on that lake in southwestern South Dakota. Storms are not great things to ride out, are they? In 2005, Hurricane Katrina slammed into the shores of the Gulf of Mexico in the United States, hitting the city of New Orleans and the Gulf Shore of Mississippi. Winds as high as 250 kilometers per hour, and the storm and the flooding killed more than 1,000 people. Caused billions of dollars in property damage, and 9 years after that storm, much of the damage hasn't been repaired. In fact, many neighborhoods in New Orleans are just completely abandoned because of the storm. One more storm. In 1972, in June 1972, a massive thunderstorm hit the central Black Hills of South Dakota. It dumped about 355 millimeters of rain in 6 hours. It's about 14 inches for those non-metric people here. In about 6 hours, it's a lot of rain in that area. And it caused a dam to break, and a wall of water rushed out of that dam that was almost 2 meters high through the main business district and through homes and other areas. When it was over, about 239 people were dead or missing, and some of them have actually never been found. Not long after that storm, I visited Rapid City, which had been in the middle of the storm, and I saw railroad tracks that were torn up like some giant had taken them and just twisted them back like that. I saw hundreds of cars up against buildings or buried in the mud. I saw mobile homes that were stacked like wood against trees and against the side of hills. The destruction was probably the worst I'd ever seen with my own eyes. I have great respect for what nature is capable of. And I know that in a very real sense, there's nothing you can do when a storm strikes. We can try to protect ourselves as best we can, but the storm is still going to happen. Same is true about the storms of life. The storms that disrupt our daily lives. The deaths, the breaks in relationships, the losses of jobs, or any one of a number of things that disappoint and hurt us. We are all familiar with these storms. What happens when these storms arrive? What do we do when our faith is being shaken to its very foundation? The scripture passage today comes from Matthew 14, and there's also a parallel passage in Mark that contains the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus was doing astounding things at this point in his ministry. In this passage, we find him in the midst of the storm. Interesting, that's where many of us find him today. Verses 22 and 23 said, immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back in the boat and cross to the other side of the lake. And he sent the people home. And after sending them home, he went up in the hills to pray. So the multitude was on its way probably to the other side of the lake or to their own homes. The disciples were getting in their boat, so the people knew which direction they were headed. So they were going to follow them probably. So Jesus went away and took time to pray. The Mark passage expands on it a little bit and say that he prayed up on a hill. Jesus took this time, and there are times that we need to do the exact thing. There's peace and solitude that can be found only in the presence of God when there's storms in their life. We need to get away from the crowd and seek him out on a one-to-one basis. That's not what this sermon is about, but it's something to think about when we dig deeper into the passage. It does apply, though, when it comes to our own personal storms. Sometimes the problems we face are even more complicated when we haven't spent ample time with God or with his word. We also need to come together. We are commanded to do so in the book of Hebrews. Let us not give up meeting together as is the habit of some, but encourage one another, all the more as we see the day approaching. But there will be days that quiet times are what prepares us for what lies ahead. I know it does for me, for Debbie. The Sea of Galilee is an amazing area of water. It's in a valley, in a rift valley, like an earthquake-created valley in northern Israel. And it is surrounded by hills, and it's prone to sudden, violent thunderstorms and just windstorms, much like the lake I was used to growing up in South Dakota. And it's about 53 kilometers across. It's a good-sized sea or lake. They called it a sea or a lake in those days. And so the disciples were on their way across this 53-kilometer lake, and apparently rowing from the Mark passage because the wind was against them. And they encountered this storm. There was probably little warning, and once you're out in the middle of the lake, there wasn't anything you could do anyway to prevent a storm from hitting you. And there they were, right in the midst of the storm. And I know exactly how that feels in a very real way, how that is. It's how it happens with us. Our personal struggles and battles can often arise with no warning at all. Things can be calm sailing, and all of a sudden, things change. Someone becomes very ill or dies. A friend inexplicably decides not to be a friend anymore. You lose your job, or a girlfriend, or a boyfriend, or you're injured severely. And it comes on you suddenly. a storm. There's something great found in this passage. Verses 24 and 25 says, "Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, where a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water." The Mark passage says that he could see them, whether he could see them through a miracle, or whether he could actually see them in the moonlight. I couldn't think there was any moonlight. I'm thinking that he could actually see them in his mind, how they were fighting against the waves. And here he came walking on the water. There's an important thing to catch here. No matter where we are in the storm, Jesus knows exactly where we are. Before we can even sense his presence, Jesus is already on the way. I can almost picture him in the water, the wind whipping his hair around, maybe the waves splashing around his legs as he made his way to get closer to the boat. The Mark passage says something that I consider quite humorous. It says that he came toward them walking on the water, intending to pass by. That's hilarious. Someday I'll talk about that, probably why that was said, but not today. The power of the wind or the motion of the water could not and did not keep Jesus away from the ones in the boat. It didn't matter. He wasn't afraid of the storm. While this paints a very nice picture, there are times when we can get so caught up in our own storms and problems that we can easily miss the one who is coming to help us. When the disciples, it says, saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It was a ghost. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. You don't normally see people walking on water. And it's not a totally unnatural reaction. Don't get me wrong. But sometimes in the midst of the storms, we don't recognize who's coming to help us. It's easy for a person to totally forget who God is during hard times. There have been times in my own life when I've become so frustrated that God seemed to be nowhere when times were so difficult. I was so wrapped up in my own anger and my circumstances that I never recognized him as being there all along until much later. Sometimes he comes in a soft and gentle whisper. Other times he may send a friend or some sort of comfort or support. No matter what he does, if we are honest with ourselves, there have been times that we, just like the disciples, missed who was coming toward us. With all that said, I know that God has always been with me. It doesn't matter what the trial or the storm was, he was there. It has taken me years to come to that understanding, but sometimes the storms are the only way that God can contact us. I don't believe he causes the storm, but he does use them to get our attention. When Jesus arrives during our hard times, he often asks something of us too. He doesn't ask us to give thousands of dollars to the church or try preaching about forgiveness. Jesus looks at our hearts and calls out to us where he is. Jesus immediately said to them that day, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." He said that a lot, especially walking on the water during the middle of a storm. "Lord, if it's you," Peter said, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said, and Peter got down out of the boat and walked down the water toward Jesus. I'm going to read that again. Then Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. Wow, that's pretty cool. When things seem to be stacked against us, Jesus calls us to walk out on the water with him. He calls us to have faith. You know, people can't walk on the water because they want to. I don't know how many times I've seen videos of old evangelists, Pentecostal evangelists, that make a big deal out of the fact that they can walk on the water. And they have it filmed, and they never walk on the water. They always fall in the water and get really wet. But in this case, Peter walked on the water. Like I said, people can't walk on the water because they want to. They get out of the boat because he is already out there. That's the hardest thing to do, to get out of the boat. You know, we give Peter a hard time in this passage because we see in verse 30, he saw the wind, he was afraid, began to sink, and he cried out, "Lord, save me!" Peter stepped out of the boat, though. But while he was out of the boat and walking on the water, he took his eyes off Jesus. Peter was quick to realize in the middle of this miracle, this is something I've never done before. It was a new experience, and sometimes new things take a little time to master. I don't know if anybody's ever really mastered walking on the water, but it was the first time for Peter. But Peter had the faith to get out of the boat. Peter started to make strides across the water until he took his eyes off Jesus. And when he was in over his head, he asked for help. If you ask me, I think Peter did better than most of us would. Often we tend to relate more to the other 11 guys in the boat who didn't have any notion whatsoever of getting out of the boat. That goes back to the beginning of the message. During storms, we've been told to stay indoors. Stay where it's safe. Wait until the storm passes. I had a brother who was always taking risks. I don't know what it was, but one day we had a bad hailstorm. Big chunks of ice were falling out of the sky, and he wanted to go outside and feel what it felt like. We had to take him to the hospital. That's a big chunk of ice hit him in the head. He had a lot of fun in his life, but sometimes he did a lot of irresponsible things. But we're told, stay in the boat, stay in the house. I also had a sister-in-law, this is many years ago, maybe 40 years ago, who was in a terrible car accident. A young man had been drinking and he was speeding well over probably 150 kilometers an hour, and he hit her car from behind. And her car launched in the air and rolled and everything, and she was thrown out of the car. She was hurt pretty badly, but she wasn't killed. This was before the age of shoulder harnesses and all of that. All the car had was seat belts. And she was always very conscientious about her seat belt. But it was late, she was tired, and she just wanted to get home. And she just drove her car and didn't put her seat belt on, and she was ejected. When they found the car had a 150-pound steel toolbox sitting right in the driver's seat. Had she done the conscientious thing that time, she would probably have been dead because of that. But as it is, she's alive and well today. In this case, Peter took the chance. He messed up, but he took the chance. Andrew, his brother, and the other 10 guys didn't even try to get to Jesus. Either way, either they didn't believe it was really him, or they thought the boat was a better place to be during the storm. The African impala, I think I've got a picture of the African impala. Beautiful animal. They can jump a 10-foot fence standing still. They don't even have to try to jump a 10-foot fence. But in a zoo, you can put them in an enclosure with a 3-foot fence, and they won't jump over, because they will not jump over a fence where they can't see where their feet will land. Faith is the ability to trust what we can't see. And with faith we are freed from those flimsy enclosures that life gives us, like boats and houses and ideas about what God wants. Because those flimsy enclosures of life are only filled with fear, and they entrap us. Peter started to sink. Jesus reached for him and said, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" The storms of life seem stronger and fiercer when we remember that the Lord is on our side, when we fail to remember that the Lord is on our side. It's as if we feel all alone and abandoned. Like Peter, we take our eyes off the Master and focus them on the problem rather than on the solution. Before we notice, the waves of doubt and despair are all around us, and we're going under. But I don't think Jesus' response of, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" was reserved just for Peter. There were still the other 11 guys in the boat who made no inclination of moving from where they were in the boat. Like I said, Peter took the chance and got out of the boat. He, like many of us, at least attempted to believe in Jesus. He took the first few steps but saw the winds and the waves. The problems are increased, and we make no attempt in the first place. It really doesn't have to be a difficult time in our lives that Jesus calls us to step out of the comforts of the boat. He does it all the time. Sometimes he calls us to walk on water when things are going good. Going well. English professors here. Moreover, it's even scarier when a person decides to stay put instead of seeking Jesus. I don't understand why we do it, but when an invitation is extended in a church service, we like to stay exactly where we are. If Jesus is dealing with us, we will stay put instead of going forward or coming forward. It's as if we do not want people thinking badly of us. I'll tell you the truth. I have more respect for people when they make a walk down an aisle and kneel at an altar. It's almost as if they're stepping out of the boat in their lives and walking on the waves to where Jesus is. When Peter and Jesus made it back to the boat, we are told that the storm died off. The storm did not stop when Peter placed his life in Jesus' hands. It stopped after Jesus and Peter connected. I'd love to tell you, just believe in Jesus and your storms will vanish. It doesn't work out there. I'll tell you this, however. Jesus and Peter walked back on the water to the boat. Don't know how far it was, but it was a ways, a few steps at least. But they walked back together. That's how Jesus works. That's how my Lord works. He walks with us through the storm, through the hard time, until the storms go away. And then he stays with you when there are no storms. Sometimes it seems complicated. Sometimes the challenges seem insurmountable. It's simply too much, perhaps. Sometimes getting out of the boat to go see Jesus seems the best way. Sometimes we just don't know what to do. Jesus calmed the storms on the Sea of Galilee more than one time. He can calm your storms. He can calm all of your storms. However, he can even be there in the midst of the storm. Sometimes the storms have to continue, but he's always there. On December 11th, 1986, my wife called me and told me that it was time for our baby to be born. It was those days when you didn't know whether it was boy or girl. But I rushed home, and we were on our way to the hospital, and she checked in, and everything was progressing normally. The nurse hooked up a monitor for the baby's heart, and she checked every so often to see if everything was okay. The last time she came in and checked, I saw a look of panic in her face. And it was at that moment everything changed. She yelled out of the room, "We need an emergency C-section stat." I knew what stat meant. I knew what a C-section was. Immediately, the place was just this huge beehive of activity. Less than a minute later, the bed that my wife was on was speeding down the hallway toward the elevators. In another minute, we were on the surgery floor. We sped down another elevator to the doors of the surgery suite. That's where I was stopped. I couldn't go any further. And I knew it was bad. So I turned away and walked over to a small waiting area. Somehow or another, our pastor had been called, and he appeared. He was there. And we prayed. And I'm not sure how long we sat there in silence, but all the while, I was watching the door in that surgery suite for any movement. We've been trying for 8 years to have a child. And I felt like as if my whole life was crashing around me and there's nothing I could do. I don't know how long it was, but those doors opened and a nurse was pushing a bassinet incubator out. And she said, "Meet your son. Your wife is fine. She's in recovery." I looked down and I saw my son the first time. And I said, hello, buddy." That's not his name, but hello, buddy, it's nice to meet you. And I don't know, I know that he really couldn't see me, but his eyes turned toward me and he looked straight into my eyes and into my heart. That was one of those storms that didn't take very long, but it was an intense, violent storm that almost wrecked me. But the danger was averted because I know that Jesus was there. Let's pray. Father, thank you that you are there in the storms, that you are there when the storms are calm, that you're there all the time. And we ask that you just help us to build up our faith. Help us to be the ones that are faithful, that will reach to you when times are rough and times are not so rough. We ask that you bless this time. In Jesus' name.